Okay, in our previous considerations of fundamental questions and fundamental moral theology in a Catholic context, we have examined basically our purpose in life and then what we called human acts, namely actions that invest an amount of human freedom and human knowledge, that is understanding. We looked at what we called moral principles, or the basis of moral principles. And that's what a moral act is, basically. It's something that has a transcendental relationship to some rule or norm of morals. So we examined that rule or norm of morals. That external norm of morals is what we call law, be it civil, divine, or natural law. But then, the last time we focused on what we call the internal norm of morals, that is, conscience, that ability that each one of us has to apply law, the practical decisions and judgments of conscience that apply moral wisdom to our prospective behavior, that this is good and should be done by me, and this is wrong and should be avoided by me. We examined a little bit as well certain moral maxims, or if you will, rules of thumb, that we can always act on a certain conscience and we shouldn't act on a doubtful one. Toward the end of that, and through most of it, we had some traditional terminology about a correct conscience and erroneous conscience, a certain conscience and a doubtful conscience. But we also became, or tried to focus as well, on the importance of forming and informing a correct conscience in the first place. That is, a correct Catholic conscience, if that's the claim that we make. There is as well, and this is important because sometimes, at least from popular conversation, you'd get the idea that nobody is ever right or wrong anymore, that everybody means well, or they're probably sick. But besides meaning well, we have to do well, and the way we do that is by acting in accord with a correct conscience. If this sounds like the official explanation, this is the official explanation, for the simple reason that I personally am not interested in any unofficial explanation. I make the claim to be a Catholic, and I want my conscience to be a correctly formed Catholic conscience, and I am interested, of course, in the official teaching of the Catholic Church. I'm not interested in unofficial teaching. For instance, when I was ordained, it was very important for me to be officially ordained, not unofficially ordained. When I go to confession, it's very important for me that my sins be officially forgiven, not unofficially forgiven. And when I receive the body and blood of Christ, it's very important that it be the official Jesus Christ, not any unofficial Jesus Christ. And that's why, in an area or a time of confusion, and I admit there is confusion, some of it is profound, every serious Catholic, I don't mean serious in the sense of drab, but I mean someone who takes seriously the truth of the teaching of Jesus Christ and wants to put that into practice and make it come alive in their life, they have that obligation to form and inform a correct conscience. I said at the beginning of the last time that this noun conscience had certain advantages, but in our English-speaking world, there are certain adjectives that go with it that can eviscerate most of that clear advantage. And there is as well something that is maybe peculiar to the English-speaking world. It's mysteriously called a pastoral solution. A pastoral solution. Let me explain what I'm saying here. I mean, pastoral is a good word. It comes from the Latin word pastor, which means shepherd. And a pastoral solution runs pretty much this way. Question: may I do X? X can be whatever you want, whatever you think, whether it's paying your just debts or performing a direct abortion. Question: may I do X? Logically, that question should mean, should I think that I may do X? But unfortunately, of late, in answer to that question, may I do X, many people are getting this answer. If your conscience tells you you may do X, then you do no sin in doing X. Okay? Question: may I do X? if your conscience tells you you may do X, then you do nothing wrong, or you commit no sin in doing X. And that, for some reason, is called a pastoral solution. Let's back up here a little bit. First problem. The question asked is not answered. And a question is answered that wasn't asked at all. The question, for instance, was, may I do X? Namely, is X the right thing to do? Like, well, these are very unusual circumstances, and this appears to be a very necessary so-called abortion. May I do that? And instead of answering about the rightness or wrongness, and it's always wrong, a direct abortion, someone gets, what they're told in its place is, if your conscience tells you you may do X, then you do no wrong in doing X. And this finesses one of the important questions that we took up the last time. It just finesses the question. It skips the question about the rightness or wrongness, the objective correctness of what is objectively good or what is objectively evil. And this so-called pastoral solution is kind of all over the place. It's not only misleading, but it's illogical. It's misleading because I don't think it answers the question, whether the question is sterilization or unjust assault upon our neighbor or cornering the market and starving people to death. That question should be answered. What they're doing here is they're tucking in a little half-truth about an erroneous conscience. And the way it kind of washes out, basically, is you simply change the subject, you answer a question that wasn't asked, and what we're saying, in effect, is X may be done except by those who think they shouldn't do X, which really turns out to be situation ethics. Now, situation ethics is a theory, an erroneous theory, that Pope Pius, the late Pope Pius XII, kind of nailed to the wall back in 1952 and again in 1956. No Catholic author wants to be tarred with that term, but there are ways to get to that point without using that terminology, and this is one of them. And it's tricky because it's called a pastoral solution. Pastoral connotes the notion of being compassionate and helpful. But any time we get advice that contradicts the supreme pastor in the church, that can't be a pastoral solution. So that when someone is pushing teaching or advice that directly contradicts what the Holy Father, the supreme pastor in the church, is teaching, that can't be a Catholic answer, however cleverly disguised it is in this. Because what's buried in here is, if your conscience tells you you can do X, then X is not a wrong for you. Well, it doesn't even clarify whether your conscience is a correct one or an erroneous one. That's why we spent some time, the last time, trying to factor out why these distinctions are important. Correct conscience and erroneous conscience. The same thing, I believe, came up with the quotation I took from an assistant pastor in Queens, a Father McLaughlin, in his explanation of why he had no trouble with the public statements of abortion advocacy from Mrs. Ferraro. He says we must respect her. She's not a stupid woman. I agree, she's not a stupid woman. We must respect her. I agree, I respect her as a person. In fact, I respect her conscience. However, the time comes in individual cases when we must ask about whether this alleged conscience of hers, at least as she proclaims it or anyone else, is really in conformity with objective reality. And when someone tells me that they are personally opposed to something, but they're really not opposed at all, and then hides behind the so-called autonomy of individual conscience, I would respect people with whom I disagree. I respect them as persons. But we cannot back ourselves into a position where we end up saying it doesn't matter whether that person is right or wrong, or doing what's right or wrong, or even saying it's right to kill unborn children, which is obviously morally wrong. So there's a kernel of truth in this answer, namely that if we are mistaken and we don't see wrong as wrong, then we're not subjectively guilty of wrongdoing. But that does not dispense anyone from that prior and primary responsibility of forming and informing a correct conscience in the first place. If they want to claim to be Catholic and fly the Catholic flag, then they, like me, have the obligation to form and inform a correct conscience in the first place. That's one of the kind of trapdoors that at least I run into a lot, either in explanations or someone said, well, I talked to Father so-and-so and he gave me permission. He gave me permission. Permission to do what? Any priest who gives someone permission to do what the Catholic Church forbids, that priest is wrong. It's like giving permission to walk on water. If you have permission to walk on water, I hope you know how to swim, because that permission is not a particularly helpful one. Nobody can claim as a right to do what the Catholic Church teaches is wrong, and then somehow or other invoke the authority of the Catholic Church to justify their wrongdoing. After all, the Church only offers what she offers, and it can't be explained in a contradictory fashion. There is as well a notion of what is called, at least popularly and in a scholarly way, so-called freedom of conscience. Is there not any freedom of conscience? Well, we want to be careful with this term too, because there is, I believe, a Catholic understanding, but there is as well a non-Catholic understanding for which this phrase most frequently applies. And in fact, I believe in a mistaken fashion, a lot of people will come along and say, well, the Second Vatican Council in particular is the council that taught about freedom of conscience. There's a little confusion going on, and I'd like to try to unpack that confusion insofar as I'm able. Let us not confuse freedom of conscience, so-called, with religious liberty. Religious liberty. The Second Vatican Council did teach, in fact it has a document, a declaration on religious liberty. It did not talk about freedom of conscience. Second Vatican Council mentioned the word conscience 72 times. I counted them. Not once in all of those 72 uses of the word conscience does the term freedom of conscience appear. If we were to look at the documents of the Second Vatican Council, we're going to find conscientia correcta, correct conscience, conscientia eronica, erroneous conscience, or what have you, the traditional terminology, but not freedom of conscience. What's going on here? What do I mean that the Catholic Church did teach about religious liberty and that we should not confuse these things? The reason I say this, and we just pause for a second, is to try and prevent a little collapse in terminology, particularly in the terminology of rights. Rights. Let us not confuse, say, the physical ability to do something with the moral right to do something. For instance, do I have the physical ability to jump off the roof of this building? I do. Physically, I am able to do so. We'll say it's an 11-story building. Do I have a moral right to do so? No. Physically, do you have the ability to throw yourself in front of a moving subway car? You do. Morally, you have no such right to do so. Physically, I have the ability not to go to Mass on Sunday, but morally, I have no right to do so. But I think what happens, particularly in American English, in common parlance in this country, as in that little expression, I have a perfect right to do what I want with my own body. Oh, do we? What do we mean when we say right? Right. A right is a claim we make on others, a moral claim, either to do something or refrain from doing something to us. The Second Vatican Council, in its declaration on religious liberty, did underline that religious liberty or religious freedom as they taught it, and they did teach something in a formal way that at least in one aspect the Church had never explicitly or affirmatively taught in that fashion before. But that's what we have to go back and we have to look at the term that they use and what it is based on, so as it does not become confused with a particularly Protestant understanding of so-called freedom of conscience. Otherwise, we're going to have to relive the Reformation all over again. And there's really no need to go through that again. We go and we look on religious liberty. If we were to look at the document on religious liberty and would go to the second paragraph, it says, this sacred synod, that's how the council referred to itself, as a synod. This sacred synod teaches the traditional doctrine that all men and women, are bound to seek the truth and to accept the truth as they know it. and they teach that there is but one true church. That doctrine remains unchanged. Okay? But then they introduce what they call the notion of religious liberty. And the Council teaches that religious liberty is a human right, namely that it is a civil right. The civil right or freedom to be free from coercion in religious matters. What does that mean? That nobody should have religious views pushed down their throat. But if we notice the terminology and we look at it very carefully, we'll see first of all what it is that they're proclaiming, what, and then also on what it is based. All right? They're talking about a freedom from coercion. Therefore, it is a negative right. It is a freedom from. It is not a freedom for doing whatever you want. In fact, one of the learned commentators on that declaration, Father John Courtney Murray, who was an American, pointed out that he didn't think that declaration said anything substantially different from the First Amendment to our own American Constitution. And our Constitution, in the civil order, does not say people have the freedom for doing whatever they want. Nobody says you have the freedom to shoot your neighbors or steal their car or burn down buildings. But our Constitution does say people should be free from coercion in religious matters. And the Second Vatican Council went on record as saying that all human beings should be free from coercion in religious matters. You shouldn't have religious views forced down your throat. Question: on what did they base this freedom? On what did they base this freedom? And here is where the question of conscience comes up, and I think where much of the confusion comes up. The Fathers of the Council were as aware as anyone that they didn't want to make statements that would be interpreted as religious indifferentism. They were not going to go on record by saying, well, one religion is as good as another, or one church is as good as another. They couldn't say that. I mean, it's as unlikely as 435 people in the U.S. Congress getting together in Washington, going into the Congress, and kind of voting themselves out of existence, that the Congress isn't important. So with 2,500 bishops from all over the world, they didn't go to the Second Vatican Council to take a vote that the Catholic Church doesn't really matter, or doesn't really count, or it's not really that important anymore. However, some interpreters of the Council would lead us to believe that that's the only thing that the Council taught, and what they taught is incorrect. So, did they base it really on freedom of conscience, this freedom from coercion in the civil order? No, they did not, and they took great pains to avoid the conventional expression of freedom of conscience. And why so? Because it is very dangerous to base rights on subjective conviction. Why? Because in our judgments and convictions, we are sometimes wrong. We can be wrong. And wrong judgments can never be the basis for external rights. Let me give you an example. Someone lives at the edge of a school district, and a lot of extra busing involved. And since their kid is the first one on the bus in the morning and the last one off in the bus in the afternoon, they're really kind of a little bit out of sorts that an hour and a half is spent getting to a school that's far away, and an hour and a half is spent getting back, and that 3 hours a day of schooling turns out to be 3 hours a day of busing. They are so upset about this, and say it's in an integration situation, and say it has nothing to do with racism. They are so incensed about this forced busing that they go down to the bus depot and they blow up all the buses and say they're really acting, it has nothing to do with who's black or white or yellow or what. But they're really convinced, absolutely convinced, that all this extra travel is bad for their kids' education. They're acting out of conviction, subjective conviction. Does their subjective conviction give them the right in the external order to blow up those buses? No. And that's the danger. And actually, Courtney Murray was one of the theologians who explained that that's where the danger lies in misunderstanding this doctrine on religious liberty. There's a collection of documents called the Abbott edition of the Documents of Vatican II. It has all 16 documents. And each document is introduced by an expert and is followed by the comments of some separated brother. There were two sets of footnotes in that Abbott edition of the documents of Vatican II. The italicized ones, the citations from Denziger and Holy Scripture, those are the official footnotes of the Council. But there are some upright, regular type footnotes that are not the teaching of the Fathers of the Council, but the particular editor who is editing that section. And John Courtney Murray made the remark, because he was the one who was the commentator for the Declaration on Religious Liberty, that all too often, he says, if you notice the teaching here, when the bishops are teaching about religious liberty, they do not base this right to be free from coercion in the external civil order, to be free from coercion. They do not base it on conscience. And he says, nowhere does that term come up here, because of the perilous notion that most people are convinced that they have a right to do what their conscience tells them to do, precisely because their conscience tells them to do it. And he says the perilous notion here is the notion of subjectivism, that right and wrong depend on subjective conviction rather than on what is objectively true and objectively right. There's still a sense in which we say error has no rights. Error can't have rights. Erroneous persons can have rights as a person, but the right to act in the external order is not based on subjective conviction. Why? There are all sorts of people who are convinced of the strangest things. I mean, Charles Manson had some really strange convictions. And maybe he was acting in accord with his crazy conscience. Do we say to him, oh, well, Charlie, follow your conscience and say no more? No, the state of California didn't say that because they couldn't say it, because he had an erroneous conscience. His conscience was out of whack, not only with external morality, but with external objective reality. So, what the Fathers of the Council did in proclaiming this civil human right that all human beings, because they are human beings, should be free from coercion in religious matters, they base this on human dignity. Human dignity. Why? Not subjective conviction, but on human dignity, because even people who make mistakes need not necessarily, and do not, in fact, lose their dignity as human beings. But they are not basing it on some kind of Protestant understanding of freedom of conscience, namely Martin Luther's famous "Hier stehe ich," here stehe ich, God help me. Here I stand. My personal interpretation of the reading of Holy Scripture, I stand on my personal conscience conviction, no matter what any external authority, any pope, any council, whatever anyone says. Well, if the same thing is carried in, and if that's what people mean by conscience, namely Courtney Murray's caricature, that I have a right to do whatever my conscience tells me to do precisely because my conscience tells me to do it, that needs to be qualified. Is your conscience a correct one, or is it erroneous? Therefore, the bishops of the Catholic Church could not get together in a solemn ecumenical council and say, in effect, well, one religion is as good as another, one point of view is right and wrong. What difference does it make? As long as you're convinced to go ahead and do it. They couldn't say that. Nobody could say that. I mean, that would wipe out true morality in about an hour and 45 minutes. What they could say, and they proclaimed not as a right within the church, but as a civil external right in the civil order, they asked all governments to put into their constitutions the human civil right that individuals be free from coercion in religious matters. And they based this right, this freedom from coercion, on individual human dignity, simply because of the fact that you are a human being. You should be free from coercion in the civil order in religious matters. We have many examples in our own country with a fine tradition, which is probably breaking down, of a proper separation of church and state, if you will. Now let's understand, when I say church and state, I mean separation of church institutions from state institutions. I do not mean the separation of religion from life, as the secular humanists mean, because their view is everybody has a right to say the most outrageous things, unless, of course, you're a religious type who dresses as I do, then you should just shut up and don't say anything in public, because you might be imposing your views on secular humanists, which, of course, leaves the field to them so they can always impose their views on me, which is unfortunate. But in this area, this freedom from coercion, every human being should have that. And it's a negative right, because they're not saying that everybody has the freedom to do whatever they want. Nobody in this country is in jail for thinking. who's ever in jail is for acting on certain thoughts. The government doesn't tell us what to think. They can't. But when we carry it out into actions in the external order, even in that order, sometimes there are interventions in the civil order, even in religious matters. Almost every summer, you're going to read about a case of some camp in Vermont, normally a Christian Science camp, where somebody used water from a pipe that wasn't used all year except in July and August, and sure enough there's a little rust in there, and sure enough someone gets a little tetanus. What are we going to do? These people, these children, and their parents, according to their religion, do not accept medical science at all. And it would be an infringement on their religious rights to force that on them. And a particular child is becoming more and more sick, sicker and sicker, and what that child really needs is an injection. But according to their religion, this shouldn't be. Traditionally, the tradition in this country was not to impose or interfere with the true religious convictions of any bona fide religion in our country, with a couple of glaring exceptions. Toward the end of the 19th century, the Supreme Court ruled 3 times on polygamy laws in the state of Utah, which may have had more to do with property in Utah than it did with polygamy, but be that as it may. But what about this little case of the kid who desperately needs an injection? Where adults are concerned, traditionally our government does not interfere, however drastic those consequences. But where youngsters are concerned, normally they invoke the doctrine of parens patriae, namely that the country is the parent of everyone, and they will, someone get a court order to use very ordinary, not extraordinary medicine, but very ordinary medicine for a child. If it were an adult, as often happens with, say, some Jehovah's Witnesses, who, if they need a blood transfusion or they'll die, and it's an adult, and they say, I can't take a blood transfusion because it's against my religion. That's how they read Acts 28:15. What are you going to do? They're an adult. But if it's a child, sometimes the state will move in because it's ordinary medicine. But that's very unusual. It happens very rarely. And it's proper that it happen rarely because they'll eventually move in on Catholics anyhow. But notice what they're saying. That person, too, should be free from coercion in religious matters. And that's a negative freedom, but even the Constitution of our country does not say that you have some kind of a perfect right to do whatever you want. I mean, who has the right to yell fire in the middle of a crowded theater? Who has the right to draw up LSD in our reservoirs? Well, what if they're acting in accord with their conscience? We tend to respect conscience. But that's not the only question. We have to ask the further question and present the next qualification. Is this an erroneous conscience or a correct conscience? And that's why, in its explanation, if you spell it out in terms of generating rights from subjective conviction, most definitively, the Second Vatican Council did not teach that because it couldn't teach it because it's not true. And besides, in some areas, it's dangerous. What the Second Vatican Council did teach was a notion of religious liberty not based on so-called freedom of conscience, but based on the fact of individual human dignity. Namely, all they claimed was, as a civil right, all human beings should be free from coercion in religious matters in the civil order. And I must say, to their credit, such places as Spain and Brazil, which formerly had concordats with the Vatican, they did not have religious persecution at that time in those countries, but if someone were non-Catholic, they were not allowed to proselytize. And to their credit, the Spaniards rewrote their constitution and wrote some of that stuff out, largely because of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. Did that mean that the Council was saying that one religion was as good as another? No, the Council can't say that, certainly not in the name of the Catholic religion. But they were saying in the civil order, human beings, precisely because they're human beings, should be free from coercion in religious matters. Sometimes we read church documents largely in terms of our own experience. And our experience, at least until the last 15 years in the United States, was kind of a friendly byplay of the healthy understanding of separation of church and state. That may well be over because of aggressive forms of secularism. But realize all the bishops that came to the council didn't come with the same experience. Polish bishops came from behind the Iron Curtain, where the government had been giving them a hard time about even building churches since World War II. Arab bishops came from places where you're not even allowed to say Mass in public. They had no illusions about the government sometimes being the friend or the enemy. But they also, what they did teach was that because human beings are human beings, they should be free from coercion in religious matters. But they did not base that on subjective conscience convictions, precisely because conscience convictions subjectively are sometimes erroneous, because they're judgments, and that's what happens with judgments. They can be right or they can be wrong. Yeah.
Father, is there a Catholic state, or let's say a Catholic country, ideally, that would reflect the truths of the Catholic Church? Now, how would that public coercion work in that case? In other words, errors have no rights.
Errors have no rights, but erroneous persons have rights as persons. I don't know. Spain changed. As a matter of fact, just a short time ago, the Italian government rewrote the Concordat of the Lateran Treaty of 1929 of the privileged position of the Catholic Church in that country. I'm not sure. Well, let's back up a little bit.
Is that a good thing?
It depends, because there were problems when we talk about. Let me explain perhaps what a concordat is. A concordat is a formal agreement. We think of the Vatican as the Catholic Church, and it is. But the Vatican is also 108 acres of territory, which is technically a separate state. And the Vatican, as a sovereign state, makes agreements sometimes with individual countries, most often with Catholic countries, in which there's a byplay, a certain exchange of favors and interplay. But very often, when a concordat is drawn up, particularly with a so-called Catholic country, unusual privileges are given to the civil government in the nomination or the non-nomination of bishops in that country. And certainly it has been true since at least the mid-50s that the authorities of the Catholic Church very much want to dismantle that particular thing. So sometimes when the Church loses something in one of these agreements, sometimes the civil government loses something that the Church doesn't want them to have either. But you could have an ideal situation where you had very fine cooperation, but at least in view of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, if you had a formal concordat, a formal arrangement with the Vatican, and the Catholic faith was, say, the established religion, if you will, still there would have to be, I think, in view of the Second Vatican Council, some provision in the constitution of that country that people who are not Catholic should be free from coercion in religious matters. They might have their own church, but free from coercion would mean, I think, obviously, you couldn't send out the police and drag them into a Catholic church on Sunday and on holy days. Now, there could well be, generally, even the Second Vatican Council, when it gets down to the positive part of their right, and they say people should be able to act in accord with the dictates of their conscience within due limits. Within due limits. Now, I think it would be the genius and the experience of each given country, both their civil authorities and their ecclesiastical authorities, to try and outline what those due limits were in the sense of what truly contributes to the common good of that particular country. Given the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, I don't think in present circumstances that would be putting very heavy restrictions on the ability of those people to proselytize. Odd as it sounds, most of the action in this area, in the negative sense, is not with the Catholic Church anymore. Most of it is actually the other way around, particularly in Muslim states, where in some of those Muslim states where they don't actually persecute Christians, but Christians are forbidden to act as Christians in public, and in some cases under drastic and draconian restrictions. And one of the points of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council was to encourage all states to put it in their civil constitution that people should be free from coercion. But I could foresee an instance where it truly reflects the wishes of the people in that country to have a formal agreement with the Catholic Church, But I think in post-Vatican II circumstances, there'd have to be a constitutional provision of at least this negative right that people who are not Catholic be free from coercion. But in that given circumstance, I think then in the positive understanding, they would have to work out what is best for them in those circumstances on what kind of limits or due limits for other people of other persuasions.
Father, is that a departure from previous teachings of the Church?
Is this a departure from the previous teaching of the Church?
Concerning the public matter. In other words, yes, a person should have this, let's say, internal freedom.
Yeah.
But whether or not they could, in an ideal Catholic situation.
Well, let me put it this way. This would be what I would have to call, first of all, there are different levels of teaching, even in the Second Vatican Council. We have two of what we call dogmatic constitutions. The dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on Revelation, Dei Verbum. We also have what we call pastoral constitutions, pastoral constitution of the Church in the modern world, which we call Gaudium et Spes. We then also have what we call a declaration, and which is a lower thing, and that's what we're calling this Declaration on Religious Liberty. What we say in the internal matter, in the internal forum, has been the evolution, and I believe is perfectly consistent with what Pope Pius XII had taught. But when we get down to one particular sentence here, where it says in number 2 of the Declaration on Religious Liberty, this sacred synod declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or social groups and on any human power, in such wise that in matters religious, no one is to be forced in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, nor is anyone to be restricted from acting in accordance with his beliefs, privately or publicly, alone or in association within due limits. It's that second sentence, which I would have to say is a positive development of doctrine, which I think in a formal setting like a council, that's the first time the Catholic Church ever said that. Now, does that contradict some of the things in our past? It is difficult to reconcile with some practices, but there are certain practices which, over a period of time and human reflection, for the overall good of the Church, which are, because I don't think it involves infallible teaching, but it involves prudential judgments, which are not to be reopened and not to be repeated. Whereas here I must say, at least that sentence, in a manner, nor is anyone to be restrained from acting in accord with their beliefs within due limits. Now, an awful lot of people forget that within due limits. But even with that qualification, I do believe, now dogma is not my strongest suit, but I do believe that's the first time the Catholic Church ever said that in a formal way in public. I personally do not believe that that contradicts what Pope Pius XII taught. Some other people do. I gather Archbishop Lefebvre, for one, insists that that's a heretical statement. The poor Archbishop is in a very awkward situation, but that would be a different topic. And even his subjective conviction does not generate the right to do what is morally wrong. But that is a change. But oddly enough, what the Church really asked for in that declaration was aimed at civil governments and at the United Nations. They asked civil governments and the United Nations to please amend their constitutions to provide at least for this negative freedom. Both footnotes, official and unofficial, say this has nothing whatsoever to do with internal teaching within the Catholic Church itself, because they're proclaiming a civil right in the civil order. Now, some people, particularly in the United States, have come along and said, oh, wow, the Catholic Church has finally got, John Deedy used to do it. I don't know, he's one of those guys, he appears with regularity about every quarter in the op-ed section of the New York Times. I think they just wind these people up, and then they go out and they're what I call sour grape Catholics. He just kind of whines in public. And his thing was, now 400 years after the Reformation, the Catholic Church finally goes on record as endorsing freedom of conscience in the Lutheran sense. That's absolutely wacko. They took enormous pains. As a matter of fact, the first drafts of this, and the Declaration on Religious Liberty went through 7 drafts. The first drafts were rejected out of hand by the European bishops and the Asiatic bishops. They said, what is this, a reworked version of the American Constitution, or what they call the American experiment? You know, we think we've been around a long time. Some of the Europeans think 207 years is not all that long. And they said, you know, you live in your experience, you live in our... But that's why they had to take such pains to avoid indifferentism. And since most of us learned things about the council or the teaching of the church largely by the media and largely by the newspapers, I'm afraid one of the things that did come across in net effect, not because the council taught it, because they didn't, not because the fathers of the council intended it, but an awful lot of what came across by way of media communication was basically kind of a spirit of indifferentism. That, well, what the council is saying is we're probably a little bit more Protestant than we pretended, and all the Protestants are a little bit more Catholic than we thought, and one is as good as another. No way. No way. The sentence before that, this sacred synod likewise professes the duty all men are bound to seek the truth, especially in what concerns God and His church, and to embrace the truth as they come to see it. They go right on record. We believe that this one true religion subsists in the Catholic and Apostolic Church. They say flat out before they move on to this next thing. But, to answer the question, yes, I think something was said here in positive terms that had not been said in a formal way before. But realize what it was and what it was said for. It was to explain an external civil right in the civil order. That's why we call it a human right. And in the human order, in the civil order, freedom is a paramount thing. But it is not an endorsement of indifferentism. It's not saying one religion is as good as another. It's saying even people who are erroneous need not lose their human dignity, and they should not have religious rights forced down their throat or against their will or the object of coercion. It doesn't say people who are wrong are right. They're not. They're wrong. But coercion or force should not be used in the civil order to correct that. Whatever was communicated, at least in net terms, I must say, I think we have we've failed badly to communicate not just this teaching of the Council, but the vast majority of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council was not well taught and is still not taught. The documents of the Second Vatican Council remain largely unread documents. The newspapers through which we read them, or on which they were reported, and they're over 20 years old now, was largely, well, some kind of a declaration was made about the Jewish people, and then this business on religious liberty. Not well explained. And if it's explained in the traditional Protestant understanding of freedom of conscience, namely the absolute autonomy of individual conscience, which is what Geraldine Ferraro's pastor claims for her, and I suppose for himself, that has to be rejected outright. This is why in saying that when we read Holy Scripture, we read Scripture with the Church. And that's why we say Scripture and tradition. Why? In the dialogue with a book, even say a sacred book, what is to prevent me from reading my wrong ideas into that book? What is to prevent me from reading my wrong ideas into the teaching of the Second Vatican Council? Tradition. We have to read. That's why we say the sources, plural word, sacred Scripture and sacred tradition. You can opt, as a whole other branch of Christianity has opted, for the absolute individual autonomy of my private judgment, my private decision. And if that is the case, then you have the inevitable atomizing of the Protestant community, which is inevitable. Because as soon as you come across a community where 3 people read a verse one way and 3 read it another, if absolute individual autonomy prevails, then you just got to split up and have another church of 3 and another church of 3. Now it's that type of thing, both on the doctrinal and moral level, that the Church, even in the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, took great pains to prevent that kind of misunderstanding. But if the truth be told, I'm afraid something close to that misunderstanding is what pretty much has prevailed even in Catholic circles. It is significant but hidden. Pope Paul VI, both a learned and a saintly man, and a careful man, more careful perhaps in what he wrote than what he policed, but in writing even on the encyclical on celibacy, in 1967, buried in that encyclical, when it said, what is the root problem? What is the root problem in the drop of our vocations? very quietly he introduced the notion of loss of belief in the afterlife and the belief in the church as the vehicle of salvation. That many no longer believe that the church is the vehicle of salvation, but merely a vehicle of salvation, as there are so many others, and so many other ways, and so many other churches, and all of that. And that lessening of the importance of the understanding of the church as the vehicle of salvation obviously affects our ministers, it affects vocations, it affects lay people, it affects everybody. And that lessening was certainly not the purpose, nor the intent, nor the content of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. But in the minds of many people, in net effect, that's pretty much where they came across, what came across, and if you ask them where it came across, they're going to tell you, well, it's all in the Declaration on Religious Liberty. It is not. Please, please, please read what they say, what they qualified, or what they based it on. Okay on that or not? Okay, well, maybe not okay. But this comes up, and it won't go away, because we're going to see, I think, in our own American situation, every now and then we run into little conflicts. We ran into them already on just a mention of Christian Science or on Jehovah's Witnesses and what have you, but I think we're going to see the same thing pretty soon, and we've already seen it in the Catholic area, but perhaps from a different point of view. And that's why it's important that we have some clear notions on the place and function of conscience and the proper qualifications. Because as long as we're talking about Jehovah's Witnesses refusing blood transfusions, or someone not getting a tetanus shot in a summer camp in New Hampshire, it can come in another way. Someone comes along and says, well, I see you have Catholic agencies in your city. I see you have Catholic health care, that is hospitals. I see you have orphanages. I see Father Bruce Ritter is taking care of runaway or castaway children. Well, now, of course, since you're taking federal money or state money or city money, since you touch money from other sources, well, gee, you're going to have to go by whatever the prevailing ethos is in this country. And maybe you're going to have an affirmative action program for gay rights. And you're going to have to recruit in that direction. If I am not mistaken, apart from the rightness or wrongness of homosexuality, and we have no question, either from Scripture or from sacred tradition, on the wrongness of homosexual acts, this is really what is behind the argument between Cardinal O'Connor and Mr. Koch and the confused Catholic governor of the state of New York. Some people are of the impression that as long as you take any kind of help or assistance, well then, since the public pays in part or in large, then you must abandon your principles. And again, it'll come under another phony notion of pluralism, a little alleged confusion, the separation of church and state. And again, it'll be out of some kind of misplaced exaltation of someone else's allegedly autonomous individual conscience and respect for it. I respect the consciences of all the people with whom I disagree. I can respect them as persons. I can respect their consciences. And I must. I am bound to. My own church tells me, at least in the civil order, they too should be free from coercion, as I hope to be free from coercion. I wish I were as free as some of they are free. But beyond moving on that, on some things on right and wrong, with all my due respect for the person, with all my due respect for their conscience, we still must come back in some concrete decisions about what is objectively right and what is objectively wrong. And it makes a difference. Maybe the case is extreme, and it is. Charles Manson is extreme. But we come back in different ways. All of a sudden someone says, well, given freedom of conscience, you can't have anybody legislating morality. That would crush freedom of conscience in our country. This is jargon. This is really jargon. In the civil order, if there's going to be any criminal code at all, someone's judgment, someone's decision is going to be the object of that civil law. Now, I'm not out of the Protestant tradition of Comstock legislation or blue laws. It is not the teaching of the Catholic Church that all vices should be proscribed and all virtues should be prescribed. That is, we should command all virtue and forbid all sin. But if we go back to a very shrewd monk, way back in the 13th century, this learned friar made it a point And he was asked the very question, should all virtues be legislated? And St. Thomas said, no. No, not all things should be the appropriate object of civil law, but only those things from which the majority can refrain and which do grave harm to the common good. That is the proper object of civil law. And he gave two examples, grave theft and killing the innocent. And that's a very nuanced position in a time when there was very little pluralism, in a time when nobody was voting. And I would hope that this is a teaching that could be revived and understood in our day, because people are just tossing around jargon about you can't legislate morality. Of course you can legislate morality. You don't legislate morality precisely because it's morality, but because it's relevant, and we do it all the time. If we eliminated morality, we'd have no criminal laws at all. Obviously, we have laws against first-degree murder. Does that offend the consciences of those who are pro-murder? Well, to some extent, yes, but they are erroneous consciences. We have laws on perjury. We have laws on grave theft. We have laws on, my goodness, we have laws on aesthetic perception. We have laws on beauty. You know, when you go down a highway, they got billboards. They got laws on how close those billboards can be. Not just for safety, that there'd be a distraction, but for artistic taste. In the city of New York, we have landmark legislation. If your house, God forbid, should be declared a landmark, you can't change so much as a window pane without the concurrence of about 95 local community boards. Now, if you can legislate something as subjective as artistic taste, it is child's play to legislate morality, and sometimes morality has to be legislated. Again, not the Comstock thing. I'm not saying let's legislate all virtues have to be done and all vices have to be avoided, but following St. Thomas and Catholic tradition, there are certain things from which the majority can refrain. And that's an important qualification, because if in fact we live in a society when the majority can't refrain from stealing or killing the innocent, it might be time to move to Australia, not to come up with new legislation. And Australia may not be a good choice, because it may be worse. But again, it comes back to questions, if you will, that have something to do with so-called separation of church and state. But again, that doesn't mean the separation of religion from life, which is really the argument that's going on in our society, but with due respect for individual conscience, not making a claim to the absolute autonomy of individual conscience and its subjective conviction, because we go back to where we were the last time on distinctions. It is very important whether or not a conscience decision is in conformity with objective reality. And in the moral order, true rights can only be based on real relationships which are grounded in what is objectively true and morally good. In that moral sense, moral error can never have rights, although erroneous or even immoral people as persons can maintain a personal right. But that's not confirming the wrongdoing that they do. And that's why sometimes when we started to make some distinctions on the word right, we don't want to collapse in a telescope fashion, a reverse telescope fashion, rights in a backwards sentence, because sometimes people are confusing the power to do something, the physical ability to do something, with the moral right to do something. Any explanation that comes out which sounds like I have a moral right to do what's morally wrong is a backwards explanation. That can't be. That is moral nonsense. And in fact, that would be John Courtney Murray's objection to basing religious liberty on subjective conviction, because moral right ultimately must rest on what is objectively true and morally good, even though true and good persons in general can make mistakes in their subjective conviction or judgments about them. We may be winding broadly. It's just that I could be wrong, but I do find that some of those issues on public morality or slogans about legislating or imposing morality, somehow or other they seem to invoke almost as an umbrella some conscience language or conscience sounding language which apparently all it has to be is invoked and then the argument is over. There's nothing more to discuss. Well, in fact, we must discuss it. We must go back, unpack some of that terminology, and see if we can't lay out on the table what I believe is a reasonable position. And particularly in the church-state area, the Catholic Church comes out of a long tradition of reason and very long experience. Experience not just with democracy in the United States, but experience with many varied types of governments and governmental arrangements all over the world. And this teaching on the level of principle applies to all of them and is meant to apply to all of them, not just to us. But it seems to me, in the present circumstances, especially in some of the hot issues that come up for public debate, a very unfortunate turn of events has come about, which is probably evidence of the triumph of secular humanism, that, gee, everybody in our society has a right to speak up except religious types. Apparently humanists have a right to speak up, and Unitarians have a right to speak up, and atheists have a right to speak up, and everybody has a right to speak up, except, of course, religious types, because if religious types speak up in public, then, of course, they're trying somehow, as a fascist plot, to impose their morality on everyone else. Well, look, in a pluralistic country like ours, there are many points of view. But it turns out, although we have many points of view, we only have one law. And law also functions in an educated fashion. Law, or civil laws, are the public record of what we as a society stand for and what we won't stand for. Sadly, we now stand for the fact that life that's less than 9 months old is entirely disposable. It's a commodity. It started with Roe versus Wade. That started with the unborn. That's already rolled over now to the newborn, particularly if the newborn don't breathe too well, or don't move too rhythmically, or don't have great potential for meaningful human relationships. It's inevitable that the same thing will carry over for the long-born, the elderly, the chronically sick, who perhaps are not breathing too well, or moving too well, or functioning too well. Well, for someone to speak up and speak clearly on the rightness or wrongness of the resolution, obviously, I don't believe that killing the unborn is the solution, nor killing the long-born, nor killing the newborn. But it seems to me we either all have a right to speak up in our society or no one does. This business that someone is imposing or legislating their morality, I go back. I'm not arguing morality simply for the sake of morality, but even in the civil order, we argue about morality because it's relevant. Civil law draws on many sources, some of them religious, most of them not. But we will be in complete collapse if we accept the polluted language of the controversialists on the other side who say, everybody has a right to get in their 2 cents, except those religious types. And that's bad news. We've drifted a little bit. We want to go back. We want to summarize, if we can. And I think by some of the applications in current affairs and public affairs right now, we see the importance of understanding clearly what it is that the Catholic Church teaches about conscience and the formation of conscience, and more importantly, the correct formation of a Catholic conscience. Because I do believe, without any rhetorical overkill, that the best contribution any American citizen can make to the public policy discussion in the United States will be the outcome and the fruit of a well-formed Catholic conscience. It seems to me that's what real pluralism is about. Real pluralism is not kind of pushing the whole nation into a common denominator understanding where the denominator becomes uncommonly low. No, real pluralism is drawing from the strengths of all the differences. Let the Orthodox Jewish community make their contribution to public discussion. Let the evangelical Christian community make their contribution. Let the Catholic community make their contribution. If the secular humanists can contribute, we can all contribute. And we'll do that from well-formed consciences. And it's important then that we understand the distinctions, but also that we don't forget that because conscience deals with decisions and judgments, they can be correct or they can be erroneous. And remember our little rules. We can always act on a certain conscience. We should never act on a doubtful one. But the prior and primary responsibility we all have to form and inform a correct Catholic conscience in the first place. This was underscored even by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I don't know if you've ever read The Gulag Archipelago, very ponderous Russian book. They say in 900 pages what should be in 9. Says the only thing he ever feared, even in the Gulag, he didn't fear authoritarian types, he just feared people who had no correct conscience. If he could see that there, we should try to see the same here and contribute to it.